We live in a culture that is now completely addicted to images, and these images are circulating so fast. So you need more and more powerful ones every single time to kind of obsolesce all the other ones.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. It is time once again for our monthly Roundup, where we talk about three of the big stories of the month. In the summer, sometimes the art news slows down, but the news has not slowed down at all, of course. And we have three stories that we're going to talk about that are very much about where art and the news collide. Today, we're going to talk about the critical reaction to the instantly famous photo of Donald Trump with his fist raised in the air immediately after the attempted assassination on him 2 weeks ago in Butler, Pennsylvania. A lot of art critics said that this photo was so powerful it could define the race. I had my doubts. Obviously, the news cycle moves very fast. This past weekend, Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race and endorsed Kamala Harris. And there's a whole new round of uses of the word unprecedented floating around. So we are going to talk about what, if anything, the lasting impact of this photo might be, why it got such a reaction, and what the perils of decoding news images through the lens of art are. Then we're going to talk about the defacement of a goddess statue by the artist Shazia Sikander in Texas, which had been protested as satanic, and the artist's decision to leave it in its damaged form rather than repair it as a statement. And finally, we're going to go down under to Australia for a story that has made international headlines: an artist who created an art installation in the ladies' bathroom of a museum as a statement about sexism and gender discrimination, filling the washroom with Picassos, but in a twist that has brought the story back into the news. The Picassos have now been revealed to be fake. Is this a serious story? Is it silly? We're going to talk it out. With me to talk about it all is our hardworking news correspondent, Adam Schroeder, next to me here in New York.
Hello.
And as ever, our senior editor and Art Angle co-host, Kate Brown. Kate, where are you right now?
I am in Ontario in Canada, but glad to be joining you guys and seeing your faces in New York on the same time zone for once.
Yeah, what a thrill to sense your energy here synced up with us. Adam, you are a relatively new addition, in my mind, to the Artnet News team. And we're talking, like I said, about the intersection of the art and the news. You come from a real hard news background, right? So maybe introduce yourself. Where do you come from?
I have written about crime and politics and breaking news situations for the New York Daily News, New York Post, Daily Mail, The Sun for about a decade. So I've covered a lot of political issues. I've attended a Trump rally. I've attended a Bernie Sanders rally and written about these issues for a while.
Fantastic. And have you seen the art lately? What have you been writing about lately?
So I have not had a whole lot of time to go see art, but I have written some cool art stories lately that I was proud of and wanted to highlight. I got to interview Futura 2000, which was a big win for me. I've been a fan of his art since before I became an art writer.
Pretty important street artist? Is that how you talk about
Yeah,
him?
like one of the most important street artists, because he basically pioneered like abstract graffiti. Like everybody else was doing more representative, figurative stuff, or, just words and that kind of thing. And he, with his like break train, pioneered abstract design. And he's been like equated to like Kandinsky and the way that he composes his work.
Did you know the work before you got assigned to that, or was that a dream assignment for you?
It was kind of a dream assignment, and I actually know what he looked like. So I went to report on Cause's show at the Warhol Museum, and him and Cause are friends. So he was going there too, and I saw him on the plane there, and I was like a little nervous, like a little bit like starstruck. And I was like, "Hi, hi, how's it going?" And he was like, "Good." And he got on the flight, and then in my head, I just kept saying, I'm pretty sure that was Futura. I'm pretty sure that was Futura. And then later I saw him at the Cause event, and I was like, hey, can I interview you later? And he was like, yeah, that sounds cool. So.
Oh, fantastic.
Nice.
So this is like came out of reporting you were doing and sort of emerged from liking the art. That's like the best kind of assignment, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's nice when you like are passionate and care about the thing that you're writing about,
For sure. It doesn't always happen.
That's the
Kate,
ideal.
why are you in Ottawa?
I'm from the capital city, so I'm here visiting family. I think I will go see some art because it's the capital. There's the National Gallery of Canada here, and they are the commissioner of the Venice Biennale Canadian Pavilion. So, just by chance, while I'm here, the Stan Douglas exhibition that we both saw in Venice, not this year, but the year before, is in town. So, I'll get to see it again in one location because, as you may recall, it was split between two venues in Venice, which maybe some people didn't find that so successful. So it'll be cool to see it in one venue.
Canada gets a do-over. Canada gets a do-over to try and show it in one place. Are you a fan of Douglas? For people who don't know,
Stan Douglas, yeah, he's a fascinating conceptual artist, and Canada, especially on the West Coast, has a big legacy of conceptual photographers, and Stan Douglas is, at the forefront
Vancouver
of that.
School, they call that, of photo
The Vancouver
conceptualism.
School, yeah, Ken Lum was among them. So I'm totally a fan. I got to interview him ahead of that biennial, which was great. And what about you, Ben? What have you been up to?
Well, not so much art in the galleries that has really moved me, but last night I went to Film Forum here in New York and I saw the film Eno, directed by Gary Hustwit. Have you guys been up on the Eno phenomenon?
No,
I haven't even heard of it.
Okay, so it's about Brian Eno, the musician, producer, who is a personal hero of mine, like maybe one of the 1, 2, 3 creative figures I admire the most. And it's a documentary about his life, but it's also a generative work of art. So every single time you see it, it's a different film. Like it takes a slightly different trip through his life. So I saw it with the art critic Martha Schwendener, who's a musician herself. So she'd already seen it once and she was like, oh yeah, telling me about the parts that were different and the same. She was like, there's a whole David Bowie sequence about what Brian Eno's music meant to David Bowie when he was recovering from a coke addiction. She was like, that wasn't in the version I saw. This took a whole different path through his life. So genuinely kind of a cool experience that's true to his creative vision. I'm going to see it again on Tuesday.
Oh,
and I recommend people see it.
Will you write about it?
I think I might. Those who know me will know that I love theme parties. I regularly throw parties that have like some kind of theme or game that hold them together. And I've always loved Brian Eno. Like Spotify tells me that he was my artist of the decade, aspirational figure for bald guys everywhere. And, there's a whole section in the version of Eno I saw talking about his oblique strategies, which are these cards. Each of them has a little like creative challenge that's like find the thing in the song that isn't working and make that the center of the next version you do, or change everything or change nothing. I was like, wow, this is like exactly some kind of activity I would invent. As a matter of fact, it was very close to the activity I was going to invent for the next party that I was going to bring together. So really recommend it. Check it out if it's near you. Every instance of it is historic and won't happen again until it's fixed when they release it. On that lighthearted note, I think we can take a turn into the very, very serious news that we wanted to talk about. In the last couple months, it's kind of hard to focus on the art news because what's going on outside of the art galleries is so transfixing. On July 13th, former President Donald Trump survived an attempt on his life at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. This was a huge news event and extremely alarming. But in addition to all the reflections on the actual significance of this event, and unless I'm wrong, I think we still don't know the actual motivation of the person who was behind the shooting. There was a particular photo taken by the Associated Press's Evan Vucci. People listening probably have a mental picture of it already, but it's this image of Trump with blood on his face, with his fist raised, yelling fight to the crowd. There's an American flag flying in the background, and he's surrounded by the Secret Service. In an astonishingly short amount of time to me, before the weekend was even over, there were just multiple takes in mainstream outlets on the news event, but also specifically on this photo as a defining image of our times. Places like The Atlantic and The Washington Post called this one of the greatest political images ever. The British journalist Piers Morgan posted just a few hours after the attack saying that it was already one of the most iconic photos in American history and one that I suspect will propel Donald Trump back into the White House. So that's a long lead in. This is a political story, but it's also what I wanted to talk about, because we're now a little ways out from this event, is about the reaction. I wrote a piece about this called The Photo and Its Aftermath. What did you guys make of this story? I know, Adam, you had been assigned to talk to the photographer, but he was too swamped, right?
I wouldn't say he was too swamped, but he didn't reply to a request for an interview. But I did also reach out to other photographers that were there that day as well, because I find that some of the other images taken from that day are also very powerful artistically and photographically. One of the things that's interesting to me is that when a photographer is shooting pictures like that, they're shooting it usually at a high frame rate in burst mode. And so there's a bunch of images that come out of that time. And so a lot of it goes into the post-production of the pictures, like what pictures are he sending to the editor at the moment, you know? He clearly knew that this was going to be a powerful image too whenever he was sending the pictures in, because he chose this frame specifically as one of the ones that he submitted to his editors.
It's also a bit of luck of where the photographers would be standing, though, isn't it, Adam? Because I was looking at some of the footage, and if you were just a few feet right of where I think Vucci was, like, you wouldn't have gotten the flag in the frame. And I think that that is what ended up driving this image into its iconic meme status, was that it had this kind of perfect flag hanging above the Secret Service and the former president and the next candidate of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I agree, because that's part of like what drew comparisons of it immediately to like the flag raising over Iwo Jima photograph from World War II and stuff like that, is a symbol of America, the symbolism of the American flag, the iconic look of the Secret Service agents with their dark sunglasses all looking off in different directions. There was a really good analysis, I think it was by Jerry Gagosian, like that meme account on Instagram, that analyzed like the eye lines of all of the different characters in the photo and how they compare to older paintings from art history. And it's interesting how people were so quick to analyze the artistic merits and the photographic merits of the picture.
Yeah, what do you make of that? I mean, immediately people treated this like an artwork. It's obviously a very resonant image in the sense that it looks like other impactful images from the past, and it captures a moment. Flood of comparisons to, liberty leading the people, raising the flag at Iwo Jima, and so on. And also a lot of people saying it's like too good to be true. It's obviously staged, and so on.
I think it was the morning in Europe when the image came out. But I mean, I immediately also was like, liberty leading the people. Like, it's exactly the same kind of setup. But I think what shocked me about the image was that the fascination became about the image. Like, in the immediate breaking hours after this happened, everyone was just talking about this picture, and it was very little analysis of what had actually happened and what the implications might be. It was almost like the picture almost trumped the moment itself. You're both Americans, so you're a lot like emotionally closer to this as well. I'm curious what you think.
I was talking about this before, and it's like, I don't think that I can recall any image of President Joe Biden having such an iconic look of, victory and survival and resiliency. I think that one of the reasons why the Trump photo resonates with people and why I do think that it will have historical implications is because his followers really identified with the throwing of the fist in the air and with the blood trickling down. Like, he's been, quote unquote, like a victim of the Mueller probe. He was a victim of, all of these different things throughout his presidency and aftermath, the Jan 6 hearings, everything like that. They view him as this figure that's able to not just withstand all of this political turmoil, but somebody who can literally survive being shot.
I agree with you to a certain extent. I mean, I think it makes a great natural symbol, and that's why people reacted to it so powerfully. I mean, I think there's the aesthetic component, which is that it's like a well-composed work of imagery about a really intense political event. So those two things coming together, obviously it was going to circulate a lot. But, and this is part of what I wrote about in my essay, I think on top of that, there's just what you just talked about, Adam, is that it functions as this kind of natural symbol. They were selling merch of it by the end of the weekend with that image, with the caption. This is, I believe, from the Republican convention, MAGA movement is unstoppable. Like, it's a very good work of political imagery to circulate a certain kind of political meaning. And I think everybody looked at that immediately and saw that. And actually, I think some of the best commentary on it focused on the fact that Donald Trump clearly knew that immediately himself. Like he clearly has the political instincts or the instincts of like a media figure that before people knew what had happened, before he probably even knew what happened, he realized that this was going to be a media event and he had the presence of mind to like raise his fist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that I saw it described by somebody was like Trump was showing he had like the dog in him, like the like fight, right? Like he like that energy, that the photo has energy, Donald Trump has energy, and that's what I think like why the photo resonates, because you can compare it to other photos of other assassination attempts. A picture of Lyndon B. Johnson after President Kennedy was assassinated. You can compare it to pictures of Ronald Reagan after the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life. But the Donald Trump one, I think, stands a little bit above those as an image, partly because of how it's composed and partly because of the character of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly it. It's like partially just the luck of having a photographer who caught that moment with sort of formalistic perfection that hits all the notes of a romantic image. You can't even see the audience, so you become the only audience member. It's almost got this like one-to-one moment. But it is also this particular character who can see that image moment, because I think we live in a culture that is now completely addicted to images, and these images are circulating so fast. So you need more and more powerful ones every single time to kind of obsolesce all the other ones. But in that news cycle itself, then they also do obsolesce quickly. Like this only happened like a week ago, and I already feel like it's become quote unquote old news. I purely am talking about the image itself, not the event and the implications and the person who died. You know, there's serious consequences to come, but the image feels old.
I think that it has staying power, because one of the things that's going to have it pop up back up is, you know, when it wins a Pulitzer Prize. There are things, and it's going to show up in other media. It's going to show up in documentaries. The news cycle of it may be outlived a week later, but the image is going to continue to...
I don't doubt that the image is going to stick around because it's a very good image. Like Axios quoted a news editor supposedly telling people that it's dangerous for publications to be circulating this image because it's such good propaganda for the Trump campaign. And then Fox News picked up on that bullet point and made a whole mini news cycle about that. However, I do want to underline something Kate said, because I want to say I did write an essay about this, but I had some things that I didn't get to say in the essay. And one is about what Kate said about the obsolescence of imagery, which is that I do think we live in a time of just incredible media overdrive. I mean, I do feel like I published about it on Friday. Already by then, it felt like I was way, way, way behind the curve on writing about it. And I was looking for other images that had that kind of iconic impact. And one of the ones I thought of was a photo called Situation Room from 2011 of Obama and staff during the moment of the assassination of Osama bin Laden. That became a big political symbol, was talked about through the lens of the election news cycle. And one of the things looking back at that really struck me is that that was an image that was memed, but it was so early in the process of the mainstreaming of that kind of communication that, like, when Wired talked about the memes about it, they literally solicited their audience for memes. They called them Situation Room LOL pics. And it just underscores that in that 13-year period, there's been such a dramatic acceleration of how images move around and how the audience reacts to them, that I do think we don't know how people respond or react to that. And to me, there was something about this sort of the feeding frenzy. I do think it's an unprecedented reaction to an image that is both about how unprecedented history feels, but also about how there's this continuous upping the ante of the way people respond to things instantaneously. And I do feel like it's a little bit irresponsible to say an hour after something happened what it means for all time. Like literally looking at this image saying, this is a great image, the election's over. I think that's a way of using art history or using the authority of art history and art criticism to like freeze politics in place when so much is happening. Like to say at the same time that we know what history is going to look like, but what is happening now is unprecedented, that's a contradiction. And I'd like to see a little bit more thought about this, because even now, over this last weekend, Joe Biden dropped out of the race. There's an entire another titanic news cycle where people are using the words unprecedented again that's happened that has changed the story.
But the question is whether an event can get linked up like a molecule with this sort of meme circulation. And Biden pulling out of the race hasn't quite achieved that yet, right?
One of the reasons why I think that the Trump picture by Evan Fucci has staying power particularly is because there were obviously other photographs there taken that day. So there's another photo that I really like by Anna Moneymaker of Getty Images, which has Trump photographed through the legs of a Secret Service agent. The artistic merits are there. The legs of the blue pants of the Secret Service agent provide like a chiaroscuro kind of effect. He's like backlit by the sun, and the blood's dripping down his face, and his hands appear to be like praying for his life. It's very like Renaissance or Baroque in it, and it's a powerful image, but it's forgettable. I mean, compared to the other one, like there were thousands of pictures taken that day, and we're talking about one picture.
It's not that I don't think the image has staying power. I think it does. I mean, I think it has resonance. That's why people want to read it in relationship to different artworks. But I mean, I just think that there's a collapse of its aesthetic resonance into a sign of political resonance. And I just think political images change meaning really fast. One of the reasons Trump is a product of an image environment that moves really fast. They were saying the same kind of things about his mugshot a couple of months ago. There's an unprecedented image. It'll be the image that defines the world. And the meaning of that very quickly reversed. Like people were like, this is an image of disgrace. Very quickly people claimed it as an image of power and something to be proud of. I just think images can change. I think people telescope a little bit what something means in relationship to how you feel now into what it's going to mean in the future. The other example I was thinking of was the mission accomplished image of George W. Bush during the Iraq War, which people described at the time as the mother of all presidential photo ops. You know, it was incredibly precisely staged. It was talked about as an image in the election cycle and very quickly changed meaning. I mean, almost immediately. By a couple months later, it was a stone around their necks. People were bickering about who was responsible for it because it seemed like such a bad thing. Now, the Trump image is a very different kind of image because it's of a real news event. I just think genuinely that one of the lessons of art history is that things change meaning in relationship to new circumstances. And people who do not like Donald Trump are telescoping a sense of political despair about the political situation as it stands into granting this photo a huge power on its own. That's my take. There's lots more to say about that, but there's also other kind of consequential art and politics news. Adam, you've been covering this story coming out of Texas. What is that?
The Pakistani-American artist Shazia Sikandar has this beautiful sculpture that was decapitated at the University of Houston. Some critics of hers, under the cover of night, under the cover of a hurricane, went and cut off its head. I think that this story is very interesting, especially in this political climate. First of all, the sculpture is commentary about women and justice, how the justice system affects women at large. But critics have taken it to be a satanic sculpture because the female figure has like ram's horns, which they view as being satanic and view it as being pro-abortion because the sculpture also has a special collar that was also worn by the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's a powerful sculpture, and people critical of abortion rights and stuff like that went and protested against it. The university police did release surveillance footage that showed people going and cutting it down. And then we do have video posted by the artist on her Instagram account in which somebody had recorded protesters that had been critical of it in the days before.
Yeah, I mean, they had to cancel a talk with her and the opening, I believe, because there was an active protest against it by anti-abortion, pro-life groups.
But I think one of the most powerful things about this situation, especially in context with our previous topic, is that the artist then requested the university to not repair the sculpture. And so the image of it decapitated has sort of inadvertently also become like a symbolic political statement about the culture wars in America right now. We received statements from the University of Houston saying that they would honor her request and not repair it. And as far as I know, that's where this ends.
What surprised me about it was that it was very much like another story, not to go off on a tangent, but there was a statue in Austria that 2 weeks before was also beheaded. It was a depiction of Mary giving birth, and it was an art installation about women's roles and gender equality, and it was in a Catholic church in Linz. This is something that obviously happened in America and in the state of Texas, where, these are particularly contentious issues, but it does, just to broaden the scope, this is a part of a bigger international question about what is an offensive image and what is like a progressive image and this kind of thing. Obviously, I'm disturbed by vandalism of this kind. And it was interesting to read the protesters back to the Sikander sculpture. Not that they necessarily have been proven to be the ones who beheaded it, but they had said art should reflect truth, goodness, and beauty. Art cannot have beauty without truth and truth without goodness. And so it's just interesting that the conversation really does become like, what is art's function for society? And people clearly thought that this was not it.
Well, I mean, it's very alarming and upsetting. I mean, I guess one of the things I was thinking is that this happened in Texas. It can be that people here in the New York art world or something like that ascribe this kind of event to, I don't know, red state mentality. But this sculpture got its start here in New York. It was commissioned by the Madison Square Park Public Art Program and was originally a commentary on sculptures around here that were all male lawgivers like Moses, Confucius, and so on, and a kind of response to that through the lens of this goddess imagery. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the idea that this was a satanic sculpture began here in New York. It became controversial here. Fox News made a big deal about it being a satanic golden Medusa sculpture, and there was just a lot of discourse about it through that lens that started here in New York that I think basically followed it to Texas, where it energized protest groups when it appeared on this campus.
I just think that that's super fascinating that criticism originated here because, like I said, I've covered news for a long time, and one of the things that I've covered over the years is the removal of Confederate statues in places like in Texas. I had worked for a small newspaper in Georgetown, Texas, which is a suburb of Austin, and they had people there, the sons of Confederate veterans, who were protesting to keep the statue in place. I'm curious what would have happened if somebody had cut off its head in the middle of the night, like the violent act of cutting off a woman's sculpture's head by a female artist. And the idea that that didn't originate in Texas but originated in New York is a little bit, I guess, scary.
Well, I mean, I think it extends the kind of argument about the kind of image environment and news environment we live in. I mean, here in the United States, and I don't know in Canada or Europe, Kate, but there's a lot of talk about the de-regionalization of politics. That it used to be there was much more local politics, and now literally everything is a referendum on national politics. Everything is threaded through that lens. And I think to a certain extent that's true of the art news too, that there are these art news stories that can be very local, like the defacement of a public sculpture on a campus in Texas, and that immediately becomes part of a national news debate over women's rights and representation and public art and so on. And the same, it starts in New York as a statement about what kind of, I believe, part of the New York's attempt to add work by women and images of women to its public sculpture. And then, that controversy that come out of that is followed all the way to Texas. I mean, it is politics happens locally and everywhere simultaneously now.
Just to bring back to what I was saying earlier, this story in Austria, of a beheaded sculpture that also became international news and then would be connected to this regional sculpture in Texas. So I very much agree with that. I think it's just interesting that art is taken so seriously and that it becomes a place to project frustrations is something interesting in of itself. And you brought up the Confederate sculptures as well. The climate is hot right now. It's interesting to see these real moments of violence where there should be discussion.
Well, what do you think about her decision to leave it beheaded? Basically, she says, I don't want to repair or conceal. I want to expose, leave it damaged, make a new piece and many more. I mean, To me, this fits with a long tradition in art. I think of Marcel Duchamp's large glass, which was damaged in transport, and he said, leave it as it is. And that became part of its meaning. In that case, about entropy and intention and so on. The beheading is now essentially a part of the meaning. What do you guys think of that?
It kind of goes to the discussion we were having about like the Trump photo, about like whether the meaning of a thing can change after, or like the meaning of his mugshot afterwards and the longevity of that. In the grand scheme of things, if they repaired the head and repaired the sculpture, the act of the vandalism would be lost to time. And I think that the artist is really wanting to highlight that these issues are so important that it got beheaded. So by leaving it beheaded, it adds to its lasting power. People are going to wonder now, whenever they go to that campus, why there's a beheaded sculpture just sitting there. And so they're going to inquire and they're going to think about it and they're going to read about it, and the story endures in that way. And so her point gets continuously made in a way that perhaps it couldn't. In fact, to the point where when this first happened, I kind of wondered if she might have been behind it. I don't want to spread conspiracy theories, but part of me doesn't trust people sometimes. And if you understand the power of symbols, you could raise the theory that it is a much more powerful symbol now that it has been beheaded.
I think that that's a nice looping back, because that is a lot of people's first impulses when seeing a lot of these images, is to think, is it too perfect of a symbol? Was it staged? I mean, you saw a lot of that in the wake of the Trump photo, and some people were comparing it to very famous or infamous photo from Vietnam, which napalm girl photo, a horrible image of a atrocity. And I was looking at the history of that and seeing that when Nixon saw it, his first reaction was, it has to be staged, even though he was, perpetrating the war. He was the commander in chief. So it is, I think that does say something about how culture processes things through images. And there's really no moment when you look at an image outside of like whatever political narratives you're bringing to it.
I would say with the Napalm Girl image, that is a different image in a different time, where I feel like there were some questions raised about it, but generally it was from a time period where people tended to believe the photography that they saw. And I think that what is really different about the beheading of the sculpture and the Trump photos, that we live in a time where there's so little trust in anything that we're seeing. And at the same time, a highly sophisticated public to what goes viral. So you have this simultaneous where everyone sort of becomes a photographer or a publisher. And I think that confluence is what makes these kinds of moments particularly powerful.
If you want to be really bleak about it, I mean, I think beheading the sculpture is a particularly kind of media gesture. It's a particular kind of like meant to send a certain kind of message as it circulates as a news story and as an image.
I mean, it's just no toppling of the statue of Saddam. I just want to make the point that if we allow like the beheadings of sculptures like this, then we also need to allow the removal of Confederate monuments, the removal of dictatorial leaders. You get into a debate about like free speech absolutism. If one of them's prohibited, like let's say we criticize the beheading of this statue, then we need to criticize all actions like it.
Sure. I mean, I unfortunately, I don't think there's much of a we to draw on anymore. I think that there's genuinely, unfortunately, not much of a sense of a we. On that bleak note, I think we should move on to another story that is less bleak. I don't know. It's still about the political situation. It's about women's rights. It's about the media. And it's about fake news. So it fits with everything we're saying, but has kind of a different tone. Kate introduced this story.
It's definitely more goofy, I would say. But it very much fits into this conversation that we've been having about virality, image culture, and also ultimately feminism. So yeah, Tasmania is where we're headed, to the Tasmanian Museum.
Yeah, talk about stories that are start local and travel around the world, take on a bigger significance.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, that's true. Although Picasso's in the fray of this one, so he's pretty international from the get-go. But so at the Tasmanian Museum of Old and New Art, there is this exhibition called the Ladies' Lounge, which the Tasmanian Museum of Old and New Art is this art institution founded by David Walsh, who's an art collector, and his wife had made an exhibition called the Ladies' Lounge. I'm going to try to tell the story as straight as possible, but there are just so many weird alleys to it. It's like I might need some checks along the way. So yeah, she had made this exhibition, and it was a women's only exhibition, and men could not enter it. And there were Picassos allegedly in the show, some antiques, some old jewelry, some historic works of art from Papua New Guinea, I believe. First thing that happened was earlier this year, there was a court case, anti-discrimination court case about the fact that only women were allowed into the ladies' lounge, which the museum ultimately lost. So the artist and curator behind this, Kirsha Kacelli, moved the Picassos into the women's toilet of the exhibition so that there was still, as far as I understand, technically a ladies' lounge. But this elevated it, as we've been talking about, from the sort of regional space to the international space. And then suddenly people started paying attention to these Picassos in the bathroom. And it turns out that none of them are real. So it's obviously like a social commentary on one level, and then it's sort of like a multi-layered prank. That's the gist. Curious what you guys' reactions were to this story.
Oh boy, I wasn't following this story until we decided that we had to talk about it. And I am not a fan of this artwork. Maybe it's because, really, genuinely, it is being juxtaposed in my mind with the Shazia Sikander story, which is like really consequential and about the generation of women's rights and the very scary state that these questions around feminism and sexism are in our time. And I don't know if I'm reading those sense into this Australian story, which we were just talking about, the collapse of context, but this seems like such a glib way, this ladies' lounge thing, to address a serious thing in this moment. And look, I've been to the Museum of Old and New Art. It is a great museum. It has extremely weird art, weird contemporary art, but it is the product of a huge ego, David Walsh, clearly so. And one of the images that I remember from being there is when you roll up to the museum, there are 2 parking spots in front of the museum, and one says God, that's a parking spot for him, and then next to it is another one that says God's wife, and that's for his wife, who is the artist behind this piece. So to me, it's like, this seems like rich lady art to me. I mean, It genuinely does. It seems to be designed to have this cheeky effect at a moment when it's like, of course, you're just going to inflame the worst impulses in people.
I think the intent of the humor, keeping it secret for women as a concept, is funny and smart. But I think that it would have been much more powerful if it had actual Picassos. And the fact that the Picassos are fake, it feels like they're just playing a trick on everybody. Nobody's in on the joke, you know?
Yeah, or it was just like all a news setup in order to get some PR for this artist.
Yeah, generate a little bit of publicity. I honestly do not care that much about this story, though. Like, I saw it and I was like, I read like the first couple paragraphs, honestly.
I think it's actually really resonant. Like, I mean, we're talking all about the news, how images circulate, what the stakes are of that conversation right now. Those are useful comparisons.
So in the context of the statement that that show is making, I think that it addresses themes other artists are also exploring. So like Adam Heimbach, a painter who also does performance art, did a show that I wrote about earlier this year where he was going to lie in state on a slab inside of the gallery for a month and not leave. And that was a lie. He was going to live broadcast the whole thing, but it was just a looped, pre-recorded broadcast. And the work commentated about perception of reality. And I think that there are a lot of different ways to do that. And it's going to be a topic that artists are going to continue to explore, especially in this like political landscape. Another artist, the most famous artist, goes by the moniker, the most famous artist. His name is Matty Mo. He has claimed credit for the monoliths that were appearing in the desert and all over the world, which is itself a political statement or whatever. I don't think he's behind the monoliths. He falsely claimed credit for this as a performance piece about the reality that we are fed in the media. So there are lots of ways that artists are like going about this. In that context, the Tasmania show, I think, has value. I do like that it was for women. I do like that it was supposed to be like men have had special treatment in men's clubs and all of this over the years. Most clubs were only for men. Men could only do this. Men could only do that. But I don't know. Besides that, I wasn't really.
I hear your opinion, but the women were offered decadent nibbles and other ladylike pleasures, to quote the press release, served by a male butler. So I don't know, are we back to like servitude being a cool thing? And then, and I quote, to suck a toe or two was also part of the experience. I'm sure it was like a turn of sentence, but nevertheless, I get you what you're saying about that, Adam, but it's just this proclivity that we have for like stunt-based art that catches news headlines. And this installation had actually been on view for quite a long time. And no one was really talking about its artistic merits until this anti-discrimination court case happened. And then people started actually looking at this show. And then, of course, when the fake Picassos emerged. So it's not like it was necessarily interesting in and of itself from the get-go to many people. And I do think that there is something to that. Like, I just wrote a piece about this sort of phenomenon as it happens in performance art, where like you need to kind of catch the energy to fit on the feed. It's not an era where like subtle work is particularly valued.
I just want to say one other thing about Kirsha Kashelli, the artist behind it, because I was doing some research on her for the purpose of this conversation. And the thing she's most famous for before this is she started an art foundation in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And then she met David Walsh at an art fair in Switzerland and basically abandoned it to go to Tasmania. And there are a lot of stories around 2011 from the New Orleans media about this art foundation that she'd started. It was in a disadvantaged neighborhood, and it was sort of celebrated as this kind of PR thing about how we're going to like bring back this neighborhood with art. And they did some significant art. And then it was left. She didn't pay the taxes on it, apparently. And it just became another symbol of even worse urban blight. She was described in one thing I said as the former New Orleans resident most likely to be tarred and feathered should she step back over parish lines. So there's something to me about progressive gestures for good PR, but not dealing with the full implications of them that I'm picking up in this artwork.
So I think that this goes to the topic about how, again, this is something we talked about with the two previous topics, but about how something's meaning can change after time. The more that we talk about this, the more I'm kind of liking this Tasmania thing because of the fact that the lawsuit came into play, that there was literally no attention. They just waited and waited and waited and waited. And then the lawsuit happened and then it got the attention. And it's not like they were like doing it for a PR stunt because nobody caught on until that lawsuit. So that's making me like it even more because it brings up the possibility of how artists and performance artists wanting to make a statement can use the legal system as their medium, the legal system as a tool for art.
Well, incidentally, she treated it that way. So when she did the lawsuit, she had like a parade of women come into the court, sashaying in, simultaneously putting on makeup, making it into this kind of cheeky thing. For sure.
Yeah, I was reading a questionnaire from 2022 with her, and they'd asked her, what would you get if money was no object? What art would you buy? And she said Picasso's, which is quite funny. So, well, I do think that maybe this was all very carefully planned out. It also seems like maybe she just painted some fake Picasso's because she wanted them in the show. I'm not even sure how much this was all kind of carefully premeditated in a way. Also, just such a weird detail that she painted the Picassos with her manicurist's niece.
That is an incredible detail. Hey, look, people should go online and look up images of their wedding. They were held at the museum. Artist designed her gold crown and the wedding rings and all the flatware. And I'm pretty sure that the artist who did Ladies Lounge at the Museum of Old and New Art had a custom designed table that looked like an enormous cock and balls at her wedding. You know, in the larger context to keep in mind as these images and these news stories circulate. In any case, I think that about brings us to time. There's too much to say about all this stuff, but it's very good to talk to you both. Kate, so nice to hear what you're thinking. As always, enjoy Ottawa.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It was a pleasure to see you, Adam, as well on the show.
And Adam, amazing to have a news person in here to get their take on all of this.
Yeah, it's fun. It's nice to have an opinion and express it and not just write the straight news.
Oh,
I get to say what I think, which is nice.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It does help people discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.